So thank you for joining us this afternoon and just taking some time out of your schedule. We really hope that you'll find this helpful and insightful. We're here for Beyond Anecdotes, championing evidence-based decisions in patient healthcare record migration. My name's Amy Stevens. I'm from ThoughtWorks and I'll be your moderator. So essentially I'll be on hand if you've any questions. And also if you'd like to ask some questions of James and Charlotte at the end of the session, please do so using the Q&A box, which will be, if you use your cursor with your hand to hover over the Zoom screen, you'll be able to see a Q&A there. So we'll try and answer as many questions as possible that comes through. A few more housekeeping items. Everybody is muted. I think many of us are used to these Zoom calls by now. But as I mentioned, please do feel free to ask questions as we go along. If we don't get to them live, please do contact us directly via contact-uk@thoughtworks.com. And one more thing to mention, we will be sharing the recording following this live event. So I'm now going to hand over to James Spirit to NHS Digital and Charlotte King from ThoughtWorks.
Thank you, Amy. Hello, everybody. I'm James Spirit from NHS Digital. Charlotte, don't say hello.
Hi, everybody. I'm Charlotte from ThoughtWorks.
We're going to talk a little bit more about ourselves in 1 minute, but just to quickly introduce the session and why we're here. We're going to do a few minutes on, the kind of subject matter, say a bit about ourselves and the organisations that we work for. We're going to talk about some telltale signs that we have encountered and you might have encountered in your organisation that are an indication that you're not necessarily evidence-based, or that you are. And then we're going to talk about some tools and strategies of how you can kind of drive that evidence-based approach to product and service delivery, and then finish off with some conclusions. So moving on to introductions, I'll carry on talking and then Charlotte can do her introduction. But my name's, as I say, James Spirit. I'm a product lead at NHS Digital. NHS Digital, if you aren't aware, is the national information and technology partner to the health and care system. That is quite a generic description, but NHS Digital does quite a lot of different things within health and care. So some of that is around kind of data and information that is generated and used across health and care. So such as hospital statistics, they are kind of submitted into NHS Digital and used for various performance and reporting and research purposes. They also provide quite a lot of the platforms and infrastructure that the NHS is highly dependent on, such as the spine infrastructure, things around electronic prescriptions and NHS Mail, which is the email service. It also builds and provides a lot of the products and services, such as the NHS.uk website, the NHS app, NHS login, which is the kind of user authentication service, and other kind of GP IT systems. And it's quite a it's quite an interesting time to talk about what NHS Digital does because of the situation that we're in with regards to COVID-19, and a lot of work has been happening within NHS Digital to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, including identification of vulnerable patients, the 111 online service, and kind of constantly improving the information and services such as the NHS.uk website and the NHS app. So that's NHS Digital. Charlotte, do you want to say a bit about yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Charlotte King. I'm a product lead for ThoughtWorks. So just to give you a little bit of an overview as to what ThoughtWorks does. So we are a global software consultancy. We have about 7,000 employees across 14 different countries, and we bring 25 years worth of global software delivery experience. We partner with clients across multiple industries, whether that be retail, healthcare, public sector, as well as many, many more. So we've been partnering with the NHS for this piece of work.
Thanks, Charlotte. And yeah, that partnership between NHS Digital and ThoughtWorks has been around for around 18 months. And we work in the kind of primary care space in a program called GPIT Futures, which is, as the slide says, talking about some of the ongoing issues relating to patient records that exist in GP practices and GP practice systems. so why are we here? So a little bit of an introduction about the work that we're doing. Broadly speaking, the work that we've been doing over the last 18 months has been split into three main areas. One is around what happens to patient records if a patient moves to a new GP practice in England. Just very quickly, I mean, there might be a perception that the NHS is kind of one big service that exists within England, but in fact it's broken down into lots of different independent organisations. So for instance, every GP practice is a kind of independent organisation, and they will have their own kind of systems and processes in place by which they handle digital patient records. So it isn't the case that necessarily your information as a patient flows seamlessly between those patients. So we've started to look at, you know, some problems that might occur as and when patients move between GP practices. We have also looked at what happens to your digital record when you decide to not be registered with a GP practice. That might be for a variety of reasons, such as you've decided to leave the country or you've joined the military. And we also had a third work stream, which we're not going to talk about in much detail at all today, which is about what if a GP practice decides to move from one IT system to another, and what happens to all the digital records that exist within that system and on various databases. We're not going to talk about that much, but there is obviously a lot of interdependence and connection between those three different scenarios. But we're going to focus mainly on the first two scenarios that we touched upon. The only thing to add to that is the lot of the work that we're doing is around kind of data standards, interoperability standards, system compliance, that kind of thing. And it's fair to say that that is a really still a challenging area for the NHS. It's come along a lot in the last few years in terms of, you know, the NHS being a kind of digital organisation, but there are still pockets of areas where, you know, paper still does exist in quite high volumes, and obviously that brings problems for patients, problems for users and practices in terms of being efficient and kind of consistent. So one of the first services that I have been working on, and I'll talk about in a bit more detail, is a service called GP to GP. So as I described earlier, this is a service. It's an interoperability service, effectively a set of standards and specifications that we work with suppliers to implement, that ensures that when a patient moves to a new GP practice in England, their record is moves with them. On average, we see over 200,000 records move each month. That's a significant volume, and some of these records are quite complex and quite long. Full patient record history for, you know, elderly patients, you can imagine, has quite a lot of detail in it. And sometimes these transfers do fail, and the pain and burden that practices experience when it does fail is quite significant. On the whole, the service is used. It's a critical part of what GP practices do on a day-to-day basis, and when it works, it's great. But when it doesn't, it does cause quite a lot of pain and burden for practices. So we've been looking at, you know, at those situations where it might fail, and what we can do to improve the service generally.
Okay, so the other use case that we're going to talk about today is the deductions process. And this occurs when a patient leaves one GP and does not register at another one. And this might be, as James talked about before, whether because they've moved abroad, or because they've perhaps gone to the army, which has a different provider, or gone into the prison service, amongst many other reasons. And we see on average 211,000 deducted records every month. And when that record gets deducted, what that means is that record is removed from the GP's practice list, it's printed off, and it's sent to a secure warehouse facility during that period of non-registration. Again, as James talked about, that reliance on that paper process is incredibly burdensome on GP practices, whether that be because they've just got to, you know, printing the record off, and some of these records, they're really quite really quite big. So they print them off, send them in a bag to the warehouse facility, and then should those patients come back and re-register, so they've come back from abroad or they've come back from the army, again, it's reliant on that paper to make its way back out of the warehouse and back into the GP, the new GP, which again requires that GP to re-input all that medical information onto their clinical system. So that whole process, that whole end-to-end process from sending the record in and getting it out again, is what we call the deductions process. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that today. So when we talk about what we mean by being evidence-driven, we are going to talk to you a little bit about some of the telltale signs that you will see or that we've experienced from our work at the NHS to tell us that we actually weren't being driven by evidence. And the next slide has a quote as to what we mean about what being evidence-driven means to us. So for us, it was about gathering the right amount of verifiable data in order to gain confidence in the interventions or solutions that we were delivering. You'll note throughout this talk today that we talk about, we reference interventions, solutions, products, services. To us, they mean the same thing. They're about solving a problem. And this is what we want to try and talk to you a little bit about today. So in summary, some of the telltale signs that we noticed that we were experiencing led to us not being evidence-driven. So we were talking about solutions and not talking about problems. We were talking about anecdotes as fact, when actually they were just that. It was anecdotal evidence. We found that we weren't pivoting when we learned something new, and we found that actually talking about value wasn't a thing that we did. We actually talked about solutions rather than actually what value is it that we're trying to deliver. So today, as I said, we'll talk about these in a little bit more detail, and then some strategies that we used to try and overcome these issues. Yeah,
so when we talk about solutions, not problems, I think the thing that's clear to us, and it's fairly commonplace and for good reasons, teams tend to exist around products. We're called product teams, and there's good and obvious reasons for that, but that can sometimes can overtake the kind of goal and vision for the team of actually focusing on products and features and releasing, on a regular cadence like products do. Whereas actually that sometimes you can lose the thing that you are actually trying to solve, which is, kind of problems and pain experienced by users. So we as a team tried to really kind of focus in on the problem areas, the pain that users were experiencing, and those were our kind of goals and visions for individual teams, rather than, just kind of upgrading and releasing new releases for the product. We also found that became even more problematic when products and services kind of moved into more of a service, live operations type scenario. Again, it was very much about the products that we were looking at were very much about keeping it operational, keeping the lights on, rather than a continual improvement and addressing some of the problems that users experienced. And that kind of end-to-end service ownership then begins to suffer, whereas people focusing on the kind of performance of the product and don't think about the kind of end-to-end experience and the journey that users are experiencing. And that was quite clear from the GP to GP service. It had been around a while. It was deployed, it was functional, it was working, but then over time things started to kind of appear in terms of information about it not being performant, it not being as reliable as it should be, and that kind of manifested itself in a perception that therefore it's an old service, it's in this kind of live state, it's deployed, but it's problematic, so we just need to replace it. And we didn't think that was necessarily the solution that we should be focused on. We wanted to actually focus in on the problem areas. Similarly, that talk about value follows on from that when you're in that position of talking about the solution rather than the problem, quite often, again, this is quite present in a kind of public sector point of view, where things are driven by policy decisions or funding rounds and business cases, quite often the conversation turns to, oh, are we taking a tactical approach to this product or service, or are we taking a more strategic, transformational view? And we felt that actually that debate about tactical or strategic wasn't necessarily a relevant thing, and that by having that conversation about tactical versus strategic, you lost the emphasis around value and delivering value to users. And again, because of that debate around tactical versus strategic, that often ended up with a kind of conclusion that, oh, we're doing a strategic piece and it's a transformation piece and it's going to take 3 years, and therefore you had long time frames, and actually, again, users were faced with the situation of dealing with problems and issues that they needed resolving in shorter time frames than a kind of strategic approach or transformational approach would actually be able to deliver. So again, this comes around because, you know, either stakeholders or users kind of start to become dissatisfied with a particular product, and then we react by saying, oh, we just need to start some work, we just need to improve things. But actually what we need to focus in on is the value that we can deliver to users. Another telltale sign that we have found is that we're not able to quickly react to evidence that we're finding. So good product teams are constantly learning things about their product, but if you find that within your team, by learning those things about your product and finding new evidence about how your users use your product or how they want it to improve, if you as a team or as an organization find it unsettling when you find evidence and you find it difficult to move to that, it kind of suggests that you aren't evidence driven. You know, the confirmation bias might kick in. We've definitely seen experiences where you know, research that has been done historically, you know, kind of months and years past, that's the thing that sticks, rather than the more recent evidence that you find from doing user research. That confirmation bias might be another reason to kind of just remain on track with your original course, but that isn't necessarily responding to the evidence that's most recently been found. And that could be because of various reasons, again, because of time cost pressures, that by having to change direction, by having to respond to the evidence that you found, that could increase timescale, that could increase costs. But again, that's kind of a good decision to make. If you have found new evidence and you think that you're heading in the slightly wrong direction, it's better to recover that position rather than just you know, kind of blindly press ahead with the original plan. And again, as Charlotte talked about, you know, anecdotes talked about as fact. This was very kind of present with the GP to GP service. It's in that situation where there isn't the right level of evidence or information to be able to make good decisions about how you improve a product. And we had that kind of perfect storm of a situation where there was a bit of an evidence vacuum, but a high motivation to initiate change or improve or replace the service, and some sort of throwaway quotes around something like, you know, the system failing 60% of the time. You know, they kind of they were everywhere, and that was because there was a lack of evidence about how the system was really performing. And those kind of quotes, they kind of stuck, and people started to sort of repeat them, and it took a lot of effort to actually recover that situation and find the evidence that actually said that 60% value is not correct, or if it is, it needs to be caveated with this additional information.
So just building on that point around anecdotes, this quote from Raymond Wolfinger, he said that the plural of anecdote is data. As James has just mentioned, anecdotes were kind of being banded around by the NHS, by team members as fact. But we thought actually this is it's quite worthwhile calling this out, because while we're not saying that anecdote is fact, actually they're kind of individual accounts or stories or observations, but that actually do represent an information source that can be used, but with appropriate scrutiny. A single anecdote is insufficient, but actually once you start getting multiple reports, it can then help you start to identify a hypothesis in which to test or an experiment in which to drive. So we're not saying that anecdotes don't have any value, but we are saying you need to tread carefully, acknowledge that they're anecdotes, build up that anecdotal evidence so that it becomes actually verifiable evidence. So in summary, we've just talked about some of the telltale signs that we saw throughout our time at the NHS. There were kind of others, but that we've not chosen to go into much detail on today. But we think that these are the common ones that are probably shared by yourselves at your other various organisations. Next, we're going to share with you some of our tools and strategies in which we undertook to try and challenge some of these telltale signs and challenge some of this existing thinking.
So this is a fairly obvious principle. If you can't measure it, you can't improve it. But it was particularly relevant to our teams. It was something that we talked about quite a lot, and some of that was because we were talking about services, products that had been around for a while, perhaps built on old technology and didn't have the kind of the analytics, the metrics built into it from day one. And again, repeating what I said before about kind of anecdotes had kind of overtaken the actual evidence and data that we had around how the system was performing. And we therefore had to spend quite a lot of time understanding the things that we wanted to measure in order to be able to say yes or no, this is how the system is performing. But that was made increasingly difficult because of the product that we were looking at had been around for a while. It didn't have the analytics built in, and we were also working with third-party providers. As I said at the outset, GP to GP is effectively kind of interoperability specification that we work with commercial third parties on outside the NHS, and we kind of deliver the specifications and they respond to them. So kind of identifying those metrics, those things that you really need in order to be able to improve the service was quite a difficult task to build in. So as we said, based on those telltale signs, we've come up with a handful of tools and strategies that we successfully used within patient record migration based on those telltale signs, and we'll talk about each and provide a simple kind of case study and example of where we put them into practice. So we talked already about owning the problem and not necessarily the solution. Obviously, product teams do own the solution most of the time, but it was more about that emphasis of saying, actually, we're not just going to focus on shipping the next version of our product. This is very much about owning the problem, and we made sure that teams organised themselves into a way to understand the problem areas, making sure that they understood that problem space in enough detail, working with users, doing the research, getting the data where it was available, so that they understood the problem areas in enough detail to be able to then move on to the next stage of proposing kind of hypotheses and solutions to those areas, and avoiding that kind of situation of over-analysing and you know, kind of where data doesn't exist or where the research is perhaps incomplete, kind of stopping work or continuing to kind of get into that kind of analysis stage. It was very much a kind of rapid approach to understanding the problem space in enough detail to move on to the next stage.
Yeah, so this visualization shows our view of the product development life cycle, and this can look very, very different depending on your organisation. You might be familiar with kind of the double diamond approach or the GDS standard phases of an Agile project. But broadly speaking, you should recognise some of the language in here around discovery, validation, delivery. And what we had realised was that actually we jumped straight into that kind of right-hand side of the cycle in terms of developing MVP or being asked to develop MVP without actually doing more upfront work around understanding what the customer need was, the market opportunity, and actually the improvement opportunities. So we were provided with that solution first for you of replace GP to GP, which was the new product with just a new version. And actually we needed to take a problem view of how might we reduce GP to GP failures. Gothelf and Seiden have a really good book also articulating the kind of product life cycle, and they call these early stages of sensing and focusing, which I think is a really good description of actually what we were trying to do. We were sensing what was going on out there, and that in order to focus our teams accordingly, and is that sort of kind of figuring out what exactly the problem is you're trying to solve, why are those failures happening, and so that we can then go about proposing the right solution to those problems.
Yeah, so this example, we've already talked about it a little bit, but the case study in question was around GP to GP as a service. The kind of at the point we started the work, the general consensus was we just need to replace the service. We need to come up with GP to GP version 3, and actually we said, well, what we're going to do is explore the problem space, why that perception exists from a stakeholder point of view, from a technology point of view, and through combining kind of the data that we were seeing kind of from the system suppliers who'd implemented it, and from the kind of analytics that we were able to sort of see within NHS Digital as kind of the messages were kind of travelling through our spine service. We found that there was definitely a gap around in the data, but we also found that there were certain errors that we couldn't explain ourselves, and so we worked with the suppliers to actually say, well, what does this error mean to you? How is that presenting itself to users? How is a user going to be able to resolve that? And a lot of the time, the errors that we were seeing, or the kind of failures that we were seeing, were actually not failures within the technology, but failures from an implementation point of view. So by focusing in on that kind of problem area, we were able to say, actually, we can resolve a number of these failures or errors relatively quickly with little, improvements to the technology side, and actually just, kind of clarify the implementation. And that kind of fundamentally changed our overall product strategy, and it moved from we just need to replace this service to actually there are some fundamental things that we can improve with respect to the implementation that will completely will significantly reduce the number of failures and errors and pain that users were experiencing. And it doesn't, and we like I say, it just meant that we were no longer talking about wholesale replacement of the service, and actually we were into that kind of focusing in on problems and continually improving the service. But there were some downsides to this. The more we looked into the service and investigated where how we were going to measure performance, we found that there were gaps in the data, and so we still found there were significant areas where it appeared failure was occurring, but we just didn't have the data or the information or the evidence to back up why that was happening. And here you can see kind of representation of how that occurred. So the red line represents large message failures, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But you can see from the blue line that over the time that we were looking at the data, that the implementation improvements that we suggested with the suppliers, we saw a marked reduction in the number of errors that were occurring. And if you sort of want to put a kind of value on that, if you like, from a user perspective, there were somewhere between sort of 2,000 and 3,000 failed GP to GP transfers each month that were avoided. And if you think about the size of that paper record that you might have seen as we've gone through the slides, the amount of burden that creates on a practice just from one patient transfer failing through GP to GP, you can imagine not just from the practice who has to print off and send that paper record, but then the receiving practice who has to summarize and reintegrate that paper record back into a digital record. It's quite a significant burden on practices. So that reduction of 2,000 to 3,000 per month was quite an achievement for the team, and was done with minimal effort, really.
Next tool that we're going to talk about is the ability to uncover your assumptions. So we make assumptions every day in our lives, in our personal lives, in our professional lives, and they'll all have varying degrees of risk associated to them. It might be that you've agreed with your partner who's going to make tea tonight. It's a low risk, as you can get takeaway if you want to, if that assumption is disproven. But equally, then there can be higher risk assumptions that you're making. So whether that be, you're picking, you've agreed that you're going to pick, one of you is going to pick the kids up from school. If that assumption is proven to be incorrect, nobody wants to be that parent, right? So there's ways, the important thing is acknowledging that you are making these assumptions, and understanding the risk associated with each of those assumptions accordingly. And it's that we're going to talk a little bit about today, and about how we go about validating those assumptions. So we use the assumption mapping tool that was created by David Bland. And this matrix just helps you figure out how important or unimportant those assumptions are to the success of your product, and how known or unknown they are. So how much do you know about this thing? How much evidence have you already gathered? Versus actually, I don't know anything about this. It's really important to my product. Our solution is predicated on this assumption being true, and actually we don't have any information and any validation of that assumption. And then depending on which quadrant they're in, it will then determine your strategy for validating or proving or disproving it. So the case study that we're going to talk about here is with the Deductions team. So the ask in this scenario was to deliver a technical repository to solve the issues of these deducted patient records. These paper records are moving around the system because a patient is no longer registered with a GP practice. And our response to that was actually, we need to understand what assumptions that solution is being built upon, and assess the full service whilst doing that to figure out exactly where those problems are occurring, when and how the paper record is being triggered, and how often this is happening. So we use the assumption mapping tool to generate some of our assumptions. So we use the future-spective doomsday exercise. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that, but essentially thinking about what success would look like for our product in X number of years' time, and actually then applying the kind of doomsday lens on to say what are all the things that could go wrong with that to help us generate some of these assumptions. And we found these were sort of three assumptions that were being made that our solution was predicated upon. So that if we changed any processes, then GPs wouldn't be happy. If we change processes, it'll be too hard to get GPs to follow them. And if we want to remove paper from the process, the only option is a technical storage solution for those records. And actually what we found once we uncovered that they were the assumptions that were being made, and we did our service mapping exercise off the back of that and did some user research off the back of that, we actually found out that for a specific user group, and this user group was for GPs who looked after patients who'd previously been deducted from a practice because of violent behaviour. We call that, the NHS defines that as being on the special allocation scheme. And we found that there was so much pain within that paper process for those patients specifically, and those GPs who were treating those patients specifically. These GPs were having to wait, several weeks for the paper record to arrive. It was already a very tense situation anyway because of the nature of the reason why those patients have been put onto that scheme in the first place. And actually because of that, the GPs were perfectly happy to accept a process change to eradicate the need for that paper record. So we were able to identify a process change that would mean that record never needed to be deducted in the first place and could be transferred via the usual sort of GP to GP route that we've been talking about today. So that was really, really beneficial. It meant that that specific user group, we could change the process accordingly so that record never needed to become paper, and that then we didn't have to wait for the technical storage solution, which we were working on in parallel. So our assumptions for this specific user group were disproven, and it was only by flushing out those assumptions and then going away and validating or proving or disproving those that meant that we were able to think about what an alternative solution for that user group might be. The challenge we had with that case study was that we didn't have the right people in the team to make those process changes, and we'll talk a little bit around some of our ways of caveating that later on in the deck. Okay, so it's one of the. It's an easy thing to say and not so easy to actually implement, but we're keen to make sure that we had a kind of culture of experimentation within our teams, and it's very much about a kind of mindset that we wanted to have, that we
believed it was okay to say we didn't know the answer to certain things. Whilst we were knowledgeable about the products and service, we didn't know absolutely everything, and we were always keen to go and find out more things. And we always said that the things that we were going to try and improve the service, we would always kind of take an experimental approach, have different ways of tackling that, but accepting that there would be varying levels of risk to the things that we were doing. We're talking about a clinical system and patient records and patient experience. You cannot really have a really kind of you have to have a reasonable tolerance to risk to make sure that you are improving the service, but obviously keeping people safe. But we always said when we wanted to when we identified the problem area, we proposed different hypotheses of how we could tackle that and talk about the different ways that we felt were acceptable from a risk point of view, but had a decent chance of being successful from a hypothesis point of view. And as I say, that's going to vary quite a lot in different types of organisations and different products and services that you're working with. But it's something that we were quite keen to kind of embed as a kind of culture within our teams. And this kind of presented itself in when we started to look at GP to GP and the types of failure that we were seeing. That again, the kind of perception and the expectation was you just need to reduce all the types of failure. The whole kind of 60% failure rate was kind of swirling around, and we said, well, the view was you just need to reduce that value down. And so what we said was, well, actually, based on what we have heard from users, the information that we're seeing, we need to come up with some hypotheses of how we could kind of experiment with that, rather than just saying, let's just eradicate all failures, but actually, what are the things that we could do as an intervention that will achieve an equivalent outcome? And so that's where we sort of came up with some hypotheses as teams to say, well, we could do X, and that might reduce the failures down to a significant level, or we could do Y, and kind of played those hypotheses out as teams, and then said, actually, we think, based on the level of risk and the likelihood of success, this is the hypotheses, this is the thing that we want to test out with users. And that's what kind of enabled us to focus in on a specific area of failure, which was where we were seeing GP to GP failures due to attachment sizes within the record that was being transferred. We could see that there was definitely a correlation, and users were kind of backing up that data that we were saying to say, actually, let's try that. Let's try increasing attachment sizes and actually see the impact that had. Equally, because we had the data to not prove it, but to actually kind of give us some level of confidence around that hypothesis, we could say, do you know what, we think that if we reduce attachment size by X, we will see a reduction in failure of Y. And playing that through as a team and balancing that risk and that kind of likelihood of achieving some value was a really useful exercise for us. And it was all about that kind of idea of saying, let's kind of treat this as an experiment. The downside was, because of that kind of dependency on third parties, even though our kind of a process to determine that hypothesis and kind of make that prediction about how successful it would be, it still took quite a while to get that feedback loop in place because we were dependent on third parties implementing that change. So that was quite disappointing that we were quite quickly able to come up with the proposed approach, but it took quite a long time to get that evidence back to say that it had been successful. But we used the kind of Delta Next approach, where we sort of said, this is our hypothesis, which is implementing a 100 meg limit for attachments will reduce the volume of GP to GP failures. And we use that kind of approach of mapping this out to say, well, were we right about that particular hypothesis? Yes, tick, brilliant. But then it also exposed some other things that we found. So we learned things by following through on that hypothesis, things that we didn't know about the service that was really important and critical things for us to know. There was things that we said, oh, that's a question we still need to answer that. And so that kind of informed future things for us to learn about and future hypotheses for us to try, and new ideas, things that maybe suppliers had fed back, or things that the team had just uncovered, new ideas that could go onto our backlog and things that might improve the service. So kind of taking that hypothesis and that experimental approach, it does open up lots of opportunities to learn from the service and improve things in lots of different ways you might not have anticipated.
Okay, so we've talked about the importance of uncovering your assumptions, and we've talked about the importance of building a culture of experimentation. And next, we're going to talk about experiments specifically. Now, experiments can come in many shapes and sizes, from that, whether that be just a meeting or a conversation with the user. That once you've built that kind of culture of experimentation, and the fact that everything you do is an experiment, or that you're trying to prove or disprove. It can also be, you know, to fully fledged, your actual product going live can also be an experiment, but these are all experiments at varying levels of fidelity. Something we used was the truth curve to help us determine what that right fidelity was for experiments, to help us right size what that experiment should look like based on our confidence. So the truth curve looks a bit like this. So the y-axis is the amount of investment in that experiment. So whether that be, as I said, just an interview, a meeting even with somebody, with an expert, an SME, right the way through to kind of releasable, scalable software. And the idea being that as your confidence grows, as a result of the evidence that you've got, then obviously the higher investment you could be willing to invest in that product. The visualization on the right hand side is from Jeff Patton's work, and he starts to talk about these zones as well, which is a really useful way of framing your thinking. So obviously try and avoid the stupid zone, where you are, you're kind of, he also overlays what you would bet personally on this solution, this intervention working. So would you bet your right arm versus would you bet your lunch on it? And obviously, if it's something that you'd only bet your lunch on and you're kind of going right the way through to delivering a releasable, scalable software, you're verging into that stupid zone. And actually, the optimal place to be is along that curve where your investment grows as your evidence grows, and your the experiments that you've run are helping to validate your thinking and your ability to invest.
And we had a real world kind of example of this where, again, the ask was to redesign and distribute a utilization report for the GP to GP service. It was effectively a report that showed, you know, per practice level, you know, how successful was GP to GP, what were the kind of levels of failure, what were the causes of failure, and lots of other kind of data items that would allow a practice and a region to sort of self-serve and manage its own performance on the service. And the ask was, well, we just need to improve that, make it a kind of a modern dashboard type report, and make that available to people quickly. And so we started to look at that, and in terms of that truth curve, it very much felt like it was kind of a medium to high level of investment, with a kind of medium to low level of confidence about how much value it would add. So it was probably just on the cusp of that kind of stupid zone that Charlotte's just talked about. So we started to sort of ask the questions around, you know, do practices find a report useful? Why did it stop getting sent previously? What did practices do with the information when they got it? And do we really need a kind of level of feature parity compared to what was available and what we might want to deliver as a solution to this? And so we had some early evidence that practices were still wanting something because they were still signing up to receive the report. So it was what we called a bit of a smell to say, yeah, there's definitely a need there. So let's explore that in a bit more detail. And then we did some direct research with those users and with those kind of regional managers to say, well, what are you using this information for? What's the most important part? What's the least important part? How are you using it? How often do you need it? You know, all those kind of usual questions that you would ask as part of a research exercise. And we concluded that actually we could deliver some value with a lot less effort than would have been required to deliver the full thing, and to do that much more quickly. And it was backed up with a high level of confidence that users really would get some value out of it quite quickly. The downside was still that kind of expectation from a stakeholder point of view to say that we needed to aim for feature parity, that the users or the system wouldn't accept a lower level of detail in terms of that report, but actually we proved through research and delivery more quickly and with lower effort, that actually we were still meeting the expectations of users and stakeholders, and with, you know, a lower level of investment and quicker timeframes.
Okay, so we've talked about the need to own a problem and not a solution. We've talked about gathering and uncovering some of the assumptions that we're making, either about the problem or the intervention. And we've now started thinking about everything being an experiment, but at varying levels of fidelity, using and determining what that right size, what that fidelity should be, using the truth curve. And this tool strategy of balancing desirability, feasibility, and viability is how we make sure that our intervention or idea for solving the problem is balanced. And we often find that work in that early stages of product development can be skewed depending on who's been involved in the discovery work, or in that sensing and responding work that we talked about earlier. But what this tool helps us do, or this kind of way of thinking, helps us to make sure that that intervention is optimal across all levels at solving the problem. So in summary, what the questions are that you would need to ask in regards to this framework. So desirability, which is, do users want this? Do users need this? What needs does it meet? Is this solution desirable from a user's perspective? In terms of feasibility, so it's can we build this thing? Can we support this thing? Can we deliver this thing? And viability, based on the above and what we've heard, should we still do this thing? Does it make sense commercially, as an example? So we're always asking ourselves these three questions. And the case study that we are going to talk a little bit around here is again the deductions work. So we were asked to assess the feasibility of the technical solution to digitise deductive patient records. We'd taken the teams on that journey with us of realising that actually the right question to ask is this solution feasible? So that was great. But our response was, we also need to make sure that we're asking the right questions across each of these three lenses. So we had, I think it's fairly commonplace now for a product team or a tech team to be asking those desirable questions. Do users want this? Do users need this? And often in our product teams, as we become more modern product-led teams, we are familiar with bringing users into our world and being the voice of the user. But I think what was probably not familiar to the NHS was those questions around viability and should we do this. So in terms of the questions that we were asking, we were saying, you know, is this solution going to solve the problem for users, for GPs ultimately, for GPs and patients ultimately? And we were asking the questions of how do we support this new system? This new system doesn't exist currently. This digital storage solution doesn't exist. How will we go about operationalizing it? Who's going to run it? What do the teams look like? You know, where does that all sit? And because we were the ones who'd done the service mapping, we were the kind of experts in that domain space, we knew that they were the right questions to be asking. So by asking some of those questions, we were able to inform the technical solution. So for example, we found that our assumptions were validated in regards to the majority of GPs not wanting to change anything from their perspective. So that helped, by understanding that, it helped us reprioritize the need for automation from a deduction, triggering a deduction perspective. But when we were asking some of those viability questions, like how is this going to work operationally? Does it make sense? We didn't have the data to help us answer some of those questions. We didn't have the data in the team, unfortunately. So it was a bit of a disadvantage. The conversation was great because using this framework, it meant that we were able to have the conversation, ask the right questions, and get people thinking in that way. But it was also a challenge for us, because whilst we had a multidisciplinary product team, we didn't have SMEs from other parts of the business that we really needed to help us answer those questions.
Cool. I'm just conscious of time. I think we've got 2 more areas to just quickly run through, and I'll rush through this one quickly. But clearly, being evidence-driven, it is imperative that teams are kind of autonomous and able to make decisions about priority and delivery quite quickly. In complex or large organisations, that isn't always possible, or it's not as kind of optimal as you would like. We were keen to make sure that we had a kind of agile decision-making process in place, and so where you do uncover evidence and you want to make a decision to shift focus or deliver a particular product, how do you go about doing that? And especially when you've got a commercial relationship from a delivery partner point of view. So NHS Digital kind of commissioning ThoughtWorks as a delivery partner. How do you go about getting those decisions made quite quickly? We used OKRs, and there's quite a lot of information about OKRs available. If you want to read up more of it, but we used it as a way of kind of not disassociating, but certainly saying we have a contractual agreement, which is with ThoughtWorks to deliver some outcomes, but those weren't the things that managed our delivery on a kind of day-to-day basis or a week-to-week basis. We used OKRs, so we had clear objectives of the things that the team were looking at in kind of sort of set timeframes, but then within those objectives, what are the key results? What are the things that we will measure to say whether we've delivered those objectives? And we used those OKRs as a way of monitoring progress, and we used the kind of routines that the teams have around show and tells and retrospectives to say, these are our OKRs, do they feel right? Do our stakeholders agree with them? Do our users support them? And those are the things that we use to monitor progress, rather than kind of contractual deliverables or release milestones, those kind of things. So we tried OKRs, and it meant that by having that inclusive, regular catch up with stakeholders and the team, to review them, we were able to talk more freely about those OKRs and agree them, change them where needed, on a regular basis, and that was based on the evidence that the team were uncovering as they went along. We did have issues with some of the key results not necessarily being true metrics; they were more kind of activity and output based, but that was just in some cases to do with the nature of where the product and the team were at, but where it was something that we acknowledged as an area needing improving.
So just to, I guess, summarise some of our conclusions from this, from what we talked about today. So we've talked about these kind of 4 key telltale signs. So when your organisation is talking about solutions, not problems, when you're not pivoting, when you learn something new, when you talk about anecdotes as fact and they're banded around as fact, when actually they are merely anecdotes, and when you stop talking about measuring value, and some of these, if you're familiar with any of these telltale signs, as we've shared today, these were some of our tools and strategies that we've talked about today. So we've talked a little bit around kind of the need for owning a problem, not necessarily a solution, the need to uncover your assumptions, acknowledging that you're making these assumptions and flushing those out, and challenging people as well. If you get stakeholders coming to you and saying something, and actually being confident to say, actually, that's an assumption. Let's make sure that we've validated that that's true or not true. The need to balance feasibility, desirability, and viability. Can we do this? Do users want this? Do users need this? And should we do this? The importance of building a culture of an experimentation and becoming comfortable that actually everything that you do is an experiment, but just at varying levels of fidelity. Using that truth curve to determine what the right fidelity of that experiment is or should be, and then how that's supported by agile decision making, and how using those tools is only as good as kind of your making sure that your decision making therefore is you're able to make decisions based on the learnings from those things, and having an agile decision making process to enable you to change course if needed based on the learnings is important. But ultimately, what we found was that to support any of these strategies, what we really need is truly agile multidisciplinary teams. And by that, we mean that teams that flex in shape and you're comfortable with them flexing in shape. So, you know, we talked about the fact that we'd identified some improvements that were process improvements in Deductions, but we didn't have the right people in the team to help us go away and solve that problem and deliver that intervention. So you may require different skill sets at different parts of your journey, depending on what you've learned and what you've proven. Teams that flex in size. So if you've got a problem that's too big or too small, not being afraid to change your team size accordingly in order to limit the dependencies. And that might just be for a short period of time, but not being afraid to flex your team size to make sure that you're able to limit your dependencies. And teams that flex in focus. So if you hit roadblocks or you learn something new, that flexibility is key, and ensuring your team is able to sense and respond accordingly. And we found that having these truly agile multidisciplinary teams underpins all of those tools and strategies that we worked with during our time on the patient record migration program. And yeah, that's kind of the key to your success. Okay, and we're over to some questions if anybody has any. I know Amy's looking after the chat for us.
Just been managing the chat. Thank you, Charlotte and James. So take a minute, just have a glass of water while I've got some questions lined up for you. Really appreciate the content. I learned a lot. So the first question I've got, James or Charlotte, whoever would like to go first. When you have a contractual relationship, such as the one between NHS Digital and ThoughtWorks, did you find it hard to achieve agile multidisciplinary teams?
I'll have to take that one,
yeah.
Charlotte. Yeah, I mean, we like I said, we've worked with ThoughtWorks for 18 months, and the teams have changed a lot over time. Over time, we've gone from, you know, kind of having 3 or 4 teams at one point down to 1 team, but equally, we found that when we hit certain blockers, because we had sort of external dependencies, we had a kind of fairly transparent and honest relationship between the 2 organisations to say, well, if we hit that particular blocker, that means we can't deliver the things that we thought we would deliver, and so there we need to flex either the team, but we also it was really handy to have ThoughtWorks as a partner, because as well as being able to swap people in and out based on the kind of the priorities at the time quite quickly, we also had kind of the people within the team who were able to be flexible as well. So whilst you might have someone who was there to act as a developer, it wasn't impossible to have people, you know, widen the remit of their role and kind of diversify the things that they got involved with. So we definitely had the, you know, kind of the T-shaped people, as we say, and so it worked really well, and the contract that we had in place allowed us to do that. But yeah, I mean, as Charlotte said, that's an absolutely fundamental thing. If you don't have the ability to flex within teams, it's going to be really difficult to be kind of evidence driven.
Yeah, sure. Charlotte, anything else to add, or shall I move on to the next question?
No, I think James covered it. I think that our working relationship was great, and the fact that we were able to talk about outcomes rather than objectives also kind of really was really beneficial in that being able to change course accordingly and have our team that have the right team in place in order to support that outcome. So yeah.
That's it, thank you. So we have a question through which relates to a question I had. It says, you've mentioned user research, but I haven't heard you specifically refer to working with UX teams. Were UX professionals involved in the information gathering / decision-making process? And if so, to what extent?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll cover first of all, James, and if you've got anything to add, please feel free. So we had a user, a UX person, UX shaped person in each of the teams. So they would work very closely with the product manager and the business analyst, if there was a business analyst as well. So yeah, UX was absolutely an integral skill set in our teams. But it didn't necessarily fall always on the head of the user researcher. We're very much about kind of working collaboratively with the different skill sets in the team. So, you know, we would also have developers go out and do user research with the UX person as well. So whilst UX might have been leading it, we definitely got everybody from the team involved in doing user research and doing user experience work.
Thank you. And then another question for you. How much time was dedicated for discovery?
Good question. I'd say it very much depends on how much is known. And so we spent, we didn't necessarily have a chunk of upfront time for discovery. We would often be kind of doing dual track work of discovery and delivery at the same time. So I guess it's whilst on that kind of product development cycle, it looks relatively linear. It was absolutely kind of dual track delivery and discovery at the same time. So yeah, I guess to answer your question, depends on the size of the problem, depends on how much evidence we've got, depends on how much of that information is known to us already.
Yeah,
it's a typical "it depends" answer.
Yeah, and I think that some of the things that we talked about in terms of one, having the flexibility within the team, the kind of autonomy in the team to make those kinds of decisions, but then equally, we often found that we weren't kind of focusing on one thing at a time, one problem area or one kind of feature set, if you like, at a time. We had multiple going at different time, at the same time, sorry. And the thing that kind of helped bring that forward was the kind of the hypotheses of type approach, that we were able to kind of quickly sort of go through those hypotheses and actually say, this is our kind of best bet. This is where we think we've got the most chance. And so it was never a case of following that linear progression of, you know, research, development, delivery. It was always a continual thing, and research was a continual presence, really.
Okay, which makes sense. And then do you have any ideas as to how to best present evidence to either one?
Well, I mean, we've probably not included as much as we would have liked to into this presentation, because when we do our kind of regular show and tells or showcases, we were always really keen to present the evidence that we had found. Some of that was really simple stuff, like, you know, we've included a photograph of a paper record, and that's a genuine paper record that we saw for ourselves during a visit to a practice for, you know, a patient record whose GP to GP transfer had failed, and you can see the piles of paper. So having that kind of real tangible evidence of what a paper record looks like, we found that was quite a powerful thing. Similarly, getting direct quotes from GPs and practice managers and patients who had had a bad experience because of failure in the service. But then we had we created our own what we call the data funnel product, which is basically a tool that allowed us to demonstrate the data that we were seeing around successful and failed transfers. So it was a combination of different things, really, that we used to present the evidence, and, you know, different audiences would obviously respond differently to different types of evidence. But those are the things that come to my mind. Charlotte, have I missed anything?
I think the only thing I'd add is we only talked about solutions or interventions within the context of the evidence as well. So we'd be constantly reinforcing the reason why we've done something, what we've seen through the evidence that has led to this outcome or this solution. So I think it's just that it's not necessarily about presenting the evidence, but how we talk about the evidence. It became part of everything that we did and everything that we talked about.
Thank you. And a few more questions have popped up on the Q&A. Was there an element of surprise between assumptions and the evidence collected?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Yes, I think there were. I think there was a lot of conscious or unconscious bias going on, and actually when we uncovered these assumptions and found that actually, like for the in the deductions case study that I talked about earlier, the fact that for a certain use case we didn't actually need a digital storage solution, and actually just by tweaking the process, it meant that those records didn't need deducting at all, and it was just something that had always been so, that was the process and that was how it was followed, and that the solution must be a technical solution. So I think there was a bit of surprise when we found that when we did that experiment and did that user research to disprove that assumption for that specific use case. Yes, I think there was, but it was very well accepted, and actually, because we talked about the need for being evidence-led, and actually the fact that the solution for that use case was a very, very simple solution, it was actually a really good message as well.
Thank you, that's interesting. James, anything else to add? Shall I move on?
No, I don't think so. That's more than covered it.
Thank you. So one more for you, and for those of you I didn't get your question, that's just, we'll follow up afterwards, but in the interest of time I'm just trying to ensure there's a nice spread of topics covered. So a question here: a lot of the points you make about developing evidence, understanding the problem, making sure anecdotes have a foundation in evidence, etc. Did you engage any benefits management expertise to help with this and determine where the value is?
Yeah, I mean, we work in the public sector, so any kind of investment you put into a product or service, you need to be able to justify a return on that investment. And we're constantly looking at the things that we will measure, not just to say we've improved this particular aspect of the service by X%, but actually working out what that looks like in terms of kind of qualitative and quantitative measures of value from a user perspective. And so we are kind of still going through that process really of understanding the overall benefits case, and we've done some really simple calculations about what does a failed GP to GP transfer cost, for example, in terms of staff time, in terms of the logistics of printing out a record and putting it in a van and sending it halfway across the country. Those things do cost money, and so every time there is a failure, we need to understand the cost of that, and so by reducing that failures, we can actually make some quantifiable assumptions around benefits. But we're also driven much more by the user needs. So when users say, well, this is really painful part of my day, can you just improve this? Those are the things that we will say, well, we know that users are right about this, and we will prioritize the work that we do based on that kind of direct feedback that we get from users.
Yeah, thank you. I have two more questions before we close, if that's okay. Have you created or used personas during your research and development?
Do you want
Go for it, Charlotte.
So yeah, we did generate some personas early on, and we used our user research. We used time during our user research to validate and prove or disprove that they were the right personas, or build on them with the information accordingly. So yeah, we did have personas, but they weren't necessarily integral to everything that we did. We will talk about our users as quite a holistic group, I suppose. Yeah.
Thank you, Charlotte. And then finally, to what extent are you adhering to accessibility standards, in brackets WCAG 2.1?
That's a very good question.
And something I might suggest, James, is we can always follow these up post session as well.
Yeah, I mean, we can follow that up. I mean, one of the things that whenever we have built a kind of a user-facing aspect of the service, so for example, the the utilisation dashboard that came up through the presentation, we used some of the existing kind of templates and patterns that are in the NHS Service Design Manual. So they are kind of built around those kind of accessibility standards. We have UX people within the team to kind of drive those through. There is a slightly, I would say, a slightly grey area with this, and that is we are working with third-party system suppliers to implement their products against our specification, and so there's a little bit of a risk that we are not completely in control of those third-party products, but equally those third-party products, you know, kind of are expected to comply with all of the industry standards, and they are kind of contracted through the NHS. Various procurement frameworks where those standards are expected, and you know there's lots of regulation that are expected of those suppliers, including accessibility, but there's some that we're not able to kind of directly control ourselves.
Thank you. So I think that's the last question, and thank you very much to our presenters for your time and the work that's gone into putting the session together. Really strong content. I've really enjoyed it, and to our attendees as well who have taken time out to dial in. This content, as I mentioned, will be shared with you within the next couple of days. And thanks everyone for joining. Have a very pleasant afternoon.
Thank you.